Thank you also everyone who's I've had a chance to meet with and all the great demos that you've shown me. I've really enjoyed sort of visiting. And yeah, I'm really excited to be telling you a little bit about some of the work that my lab has been doing. So I'm the head of the Intelligent Autonomous Manipulation Lab, or the IM Lab, and sort of talking about modularity, learning to structure robot manipulation skills. So in the future, we want robots to perform a wide range of different tasks. We want robots to enter new domains that they're not currently available in. So we want them to work in hospitals, homes, elderly care, search and rescue, agriculture. And a lot of the challenges there are really about generalization, right? Being able to handle more versatile situations, working with different kinds of objects, different kinds of tools, different kinds of tasks, and as you can imagine, it quickly becomes almost this insurmountable sort of challenge. And so we need to some way think about how do we break that down, how do we make it more accessible, and how do we sort of have robots that can actually learn the manipulation skills needed in order to perform to do these tasks. And when we think about manipulation skills, I always think about sort of three core columns. So first of all, we want them to be versatile. This means really about generalizing to new situations. So this means using things between like components from a given task, using it in a new task, being able to handle variations in objects between tasks or even within the same task. It's also important that we can learn efficiently. So you can imagine this as being sort of using very small amounts of data, but I think it also really means about being able to incorporate different kinds of data, right? So sometimes learning from demonstrations is better. Sometimes you want to learn from self-supervised or reinforcement learning. You have data from the internet, prior learned models. There's lots of different places where you can get sort of prior structure. And so in order to learn efficiency is really about combining those together in order to be able to perform new tasks as quickly as possible. And then finally, we also want our skills to be robust and reliable. And to me, this means not just avoiding errors. As a clumsy person, I still think I'm fairly reliable. But we need to be able to also detect when errors happen, right? We need to be able to recover from errors when they do happen. And that can take on various different forms. Maybe we have to learn a new skill, maybe we have to replan, maybe we have to ask for help. But being able to detect when errors happen is a very key part for making these sort of robust and versatile manipulation skills. And when we think about sort of, versatility, efficiency, and robustness, I think a core way of achieving all those is through modularity, right? So we want to take this very big problem of having robots work in various different domains, and we need to have a way to kind of break down that problem to smaller components that are more easily, learnable, that are reusable, and be able to then compose again for different tasks, these modules so that we can perform the overall tasks, right? So through modularity, we get more tractable subtasks, we can focus on specific tasks, we can have more tailored solutions. So thinking about, not just having a general solution for everything, but trying to find, for example, skill structures that are suitable for a specific task, which allows for better generalization and also more data efficiency. And like I said, reusable and extendable components. So in this talk, I've kind of broken it down to three parts. So the first section is going to be looking at the modularity and the structuring of manipulation skills. So how can we sort of look at them as different components? How can we sort of use some simulation knowledge, for example, in order to structure them? How we think about different sensor modalities within manipulation skills in order to sort of achieve these idealized manipulation skills. The second part is going to be looking at the scope of skills and models. So when we think about modularity, we're going to have individual components, and rather than just plugging them together any which way, we need to think about when do each of these different modules actually work, right? When can I use a certain skill? When can I use a certain transition model? What do I do if I can't use the components I already have available? And the last part I'm going to talk about is modularity for hardware. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of sensor replacement and also looking at sort of the modular hand design that we've been working on and how that allows us to kind of explore a space of different hand designs. All right. Any questions so far? No. All right. So then let's talk about modularity and skills. So when we think about skill modularity, we often think about sort of sequences of skills, but there's also a lot of modularity within individual skills. right? So if you imagine trying to insert a screwdriver into a screw head or rotating it, each one of these we can kind of break down into individual sort of controllers. So for example, when we're inserting the screwdriver, we need to make sure that our tip of the screwdriver and the head of the screw, we're reaching that point. But we also need to make sure that we have alignment, so the two axes should be sort of collinear with each other in order to perform that task. When we then try to do the actual screwing, we need to obviously maintain alignment. At this point, we may want to switch over to something like force control, where we're actually pushing into the screw, and we also need to rotate around that alignment axis, all right? And so when we look at this, we see a couple of key characteristics that are fairly common in manipulation. So first of all, a lot of the subtasks are object-centric, right? We're really reasoning about the geometry of the object and both the screw and the screwdriver. We can see that we have various different controllers, and they are also being shared between them. So for example, the alignment controller between the first and the second skill is pretty much the same thing. And we can sort of compose these skills out of sort of more simple task axis controllers. And that was really the core idea of this project, was to look at actually can we have robots sort of compose skills out of individual single axis object-centric controllers in order to create these various different skills. So how do we do this? Well, we first create a library of object-centric task axis controllers. So each one of these consists of certain elements. So effectively we have a object key point, so this is a point on the object of interest. We have an end effector key point that could also be a tool key point if we're thinking about something like a screwdriver, or it could be the point on the hand. We have a individual axes that we're sort of going to be thinking about our controller controlling along that axis. And then we also have a controller type. And this could be, for example, something very simple like a position controller, maybe with a trajectory generator. We have different trajectory generators. It might be force control, impedance control. It could be something as complicated as a neural network if needed. But the idea is that we want to sort of allow the robot to find these sort of tailored representations that can in many cases be fairly simple, but they're well suited for the specific task. We then want to have a neural network that's going to select a set of these controllers, which we're then going to combine into a skill structure, and then we can execute that. And for this first project, we actually had the robot executed for about 10 steps, I believe it was, before it then went back to select controllers again. So we allowed it to frequently be changing between different controllers, although later on, we actually looked more at sort of, between every mode switch, we would change controllers, but not every sort of 10 steps. So let's look at an example of this. So imagine you have this green robot. It's a block. We have this sort of static gray environment, and we have this red block that the robot should be sliding to get to the top position over here. All right. We also have a library of task axis controllers here, given by the arrows. So the the purple ones, kind of see the purple? Okay, I have to slide over there. Sorry, I was pointing on the on the wrong screen. So we have these purple arrows here. For example, these are going to be force controllers. We have position control in the blue. And what we want the network to do is to actually choose a set of these 4 controllers, in this case 2 of them, in order to create our skill. So ideally what I would choose is that the first one is going to be the highest priority. It's going to be the force control to make sure we have a nice firm pushing against the block. And then secondly, we have moving actually to the top corner there so that we get the actual sliding motion. And when we combine these, we need to consider the fact that if we just add both of those together, we're going to be applying too much force. So we need to effectively project them in the null space of each other, or effectively make them orthogonal. So this lower priority axis, we can just project down so it's orthogonal, and so now we get a nice force position controller for actually sliding up that object, right? So one challenge here is obviously how do we, train the network in an efficient manner. We get this kind of combinatoric explosion of different controllers that we can combine. And if we do that naively, then it becomes a very challenging problem. So the way that we approached it is by using what's known as an extended MDP formulation. So rather than choosing all 3 controllers or however many controllers at the same time, what we would do is we would sort of say that between every execute, we actually have 3 steps where we choose one controller at a time, and whichever controller we choose, we add that to the state space for the following step, right? So we would choose, for example, C1, add that to our state space, that we select whichever controller we chose for that one, and then C2 could sort of, based on what we chose for that one, select the next one, and so forth until we choose the 3 controllers in this case. We would then execute for a while, and then we would again go through this process. And so this simply allows the value function to capture, for example, the fact that certain selections are going to give you sort of better values. So maybe the fact that we have a force control for the first one is generally going to be sort of a better performance than if we tried going directly for a position control for choosing one of the other axes. So with that sharing of information, it can learn more efficiently, and then we actually just used off-the-shelf PPO in order to train this network to choose the multiple axes for our tasks. So here we have some of the evaluation domains. So on the left, you can see this. I think I just walk over here and point to that. Yeah, okay. Sorry for the people on Zoom. So here we have, really the task that we looked at before. This is one where the green block is supposed to be slid into that slot down there. We also have some screwing and door opening tasks, which we also did on the real robot. And we looked at different ways of sort of representing the action space. So, the most naive way is to kind of just say, okay, we're going to go directly in the end effector space. So this is the classical kind of action representation where the robot can just move its end effector around. As we can see here, often we get fairly low performance, especially things like the hex screw and the opening door. And that's because there's not a lot of sort of object-centric priors there, right? With the controllers that we have, there's a stronger tendency to move towards the objects, to interact with them. And so that becomes a lot easier. We did try things such as, the combinatoric, so all, n to the power 3 different actions. We also tried, so these are our methods, these last 2. When we have that extended MDP, we could either sort of add a one-hot encoding for each one that we choose, or we could just superimpose them so the length stays the same, but we don't know which one was the highest priority from the first 2. Both cases, it worked fairly well. The sort of expanded with n one-hot encodings is a little bit better. Combinatoric, you can see some tasks such as the block push and the block fit. Those it performed fairly poorly at. Even though these seem like more sort of simple toy tasks, there's a lot sort of less structure there. So it's not like, we have an attractor to the handle or something like that, but we have for every single possible surface attractors. We have force control for different surfaces. So in some ways, even though they look simpler, these are actually still fairly challenging tasks. Are there any questions?
So the real-world policy, also the real-world experiment is use the policy trained in simulations, and then.
Yes. So at this point, we were still learning everything in simulation. So here you can see training steps, 14 million. Fairly expensive training. So we did sort of train these in simulation, and then we ported them over to the real robot. This is this was 2020, so this was COVID time, so this is actually Jackie's apartment where this was happening. We also did, a screwdriver screwing task. Again, we can learn it nicely in simulation. We can port it over. It also generalizes between different screw sizes. But yeah, there was a lot of sort of exploration involved in this, and one of the problems was the fact that every 10 steps, it could sort of choose a different action. So in some ways, it was a very difficult problem because there might be multiple kind of controllers to kind of move you towards, for example, the handle or towards the screwdriver, and it's not really clear which one's really the best. They're all kind of moving the same direction. And so in later works, what we did is we sort of said, okay, we're not going to learn this every 10 steps, but we're going to sort of have it as a complete skill, right? So usually, if you want to do something like, inverting into a screw into a screwdriver into a screw, then there's going to be certain axes that you can use. You don't need to constantly be changing that coordinate frame that you're working in. And so for this paper, what we looked into is using a little bit of learning from demonstration as well, right? So what we can do is we can look at our objects, we can generate a whole bunch of key points on the objects in our hand, we can create different axes, different controllers, and so what you get is this fairly rich space here of different potential skills, right, to use. What we can do then is we can give some demonstrations, and the demonstrations are really useful because they kind of show that only some of the skills are really going to make sense in this case, right? Some of them are just not going to be actually what you would expect, like they're not going to describe the behavior, and so you can narrow it down. But there's still some ambiguity there, right? So my favorite example is if you're wiping at the table of a surface, right? Often table surfaces are aligned with a normal, so like vertical direction, and so you have the table normal and the vertical direction are collinear, so it's not actually clear, like if I tilted the table, which of those should I be using? So in that case, we still need some reinforcement learning so that as the robot is introduced to different environments, so with a tilted table, for example, it can then finally choose the skill representation that's actually the best. And it also has, a small number of different parameters in this case. So for example, you might have some DMP parameters, or for like a force control, you might have the magnitude of the force that you're trying to apply. But that's a very small space of parameters. And so that learning we could actually do on the real world robot. So we give it, I think it was like 6 demonstrations or something like that, just to kind of get it started. And then we did some, a couple hundred kind of real robot rollouts on the real system, and it could learn tasks such as opening up a box, which is fairly forceful and needs some force control there, and a wiping task, right? And so, the nice thing here is that, well, first of all, we can do the actual learning on the real system because we have these sort of tailored representations, and these are now, fairly tailored, so they're nice, interpretable, and it's not sort of a jack-of-all-trades representation like a lot of neural networks. You could still put neural networks into this if you wanted to, right? You could have for individual axes neural networks. That's something we still want to kind of explore more. But it's also nice being able to use a lot of this sort of classical control and bringing it into this framework. All right.
At the bottom, how many different dots are those actually?
How many different dots?
Yeah, I mean, how many actual experiments did we see, or did it loop?
Oh, I think it might have been looping. So this is also, I think, after the learning. So during the learning, the student was also like moving the plate around to different locations and stuff like that. But slightly frustratingly, they didn't take a video of that.
And I don't think it's just looping. I think the dots are slightly different.
Oh, it could be that there's a couple of different ones, but like the plane, for example, is always the same. And all right, so again, thinking about sort of how do we structure policies, this project was looking at the idea of, if we have a very simple model of our environment, what can we actually use that for? Classically, there's a lot of sort of domain randomization and kind of hoping with that we're going to have a very small shift to the real world. But we kind of thought that, there's a lot of structure that we can kind of get from a simulation. So if you think about intuitive physics, I think we've all had situations where we thought the world was going to work a certain way in our head. It doesn't quite work that way, but we can still, use our intuitive physics to remove a lot of irrelevant objects, right? So yeah, I don't know, if you're trying to, for example, open up a door, you may not have a great simulation of that door, but you can probably work out the fact that, it doesn't really matter, the fact that there's a water stand or water cooler next to it or the hat rack, as long as they're sort of a little bit away from it. But, things such as the width of the door is going to be very important. Height probably isn't that important. And so we wanted the robot to be able to do a similar kind of reasoning using a simple model of the world, right? So the key idea is that, you're going to have a bunch of different context parameters, object parameters. You can think of these. We want to have a neural network, or in some cases even a linear mapping to some skill parameters. So for example, you have a DMP or just a simple waypoint parameters. And rather than sort of taking just all the different objects in the scene, which is obviously going to get bigger and bigger as more complicated scenes, we want to be able to identify what are the relevant ones. And to do that, we use a simple internal simulation and perform causal interventions in it. So what does this look like? So let's imagine we have a specific scenario, right? We want to do sort of block stacking. And here we have 3 blocks. They have different heights. They have different positions. And if we want to learn the general task, that's going to be quite difficult. But for a very specific instance, we can effectively use some kind of a trajectory generator to figure out that, like, okay, this red block needs to go to that location. Once we've solved that task, it's a question like, okay, now we have a solution. What can we actually do to see, what's actually important? So, for example, we could change the x position of this orange block, execute the exact same trajectory in simulation, and we'll see the task still succeeds, right? There's no change. Whereas if we change the height of this yellow one, well, then it's sort of, no longer on top of the block, so this is actually a failure. So the height of this block is actually important, right? And so we can identify that, for example, the x position of this block is irrelevant, but the y height of the block is relevant. Does that make sense? All right. We can also go one step further. So if we, for example, know that the position of the blue block is important, what we can do is we can modify the position of the blue block, and then we can resolve the problem. All right. So we went from solving it for the first situation with theta to now solving it with theta dash. And then what we can do is we can find the smallest set of changes that we need to do from theta to theta dash in order to resolve that problem. So for example, in this case, we don't really need to sort of go higher up, right? It kind of figured out a trajectory that was higher, but it's not really necessary. And so, we know that the parameter for the height of this arching motion that we're doing shouldn't depend on the horizontal position of this blue block, but the actual parameter for the horizontal offset, so the theta x of this trajectory, that does need to change in order to solve this new situation. And so now we can sort of say that, okay, theta x is going to depend on the change in the position of x, but theta y is not going to depend on it. And so rather than just selecting the relevant parameters and having all of those parameters be mapped to all of the skill parameters, we can sort of take subsets of these and sort of say, for example, these two might be relevant for theta 1, these two are going to be relevant for theta 2, and only this one is going to be relevant for theta 3. Okay. All right, so started off some evaluations looking at sort of block placements. We had a very simple analytical model. This is our internal model, so this is our sort of intuitive physics. Kind of went from simulation to simulation for these evaluations, just so we can get a nice rich domain. It nicely sort of identifies that there is a subset of the object that you're kind of picking up. The object that you're placing is really about the height. And a lot of the other objects are kind of just irrelevant in these situations. We also looked at crate opening. So this is a case where we can just add a whole bunch of additional objects to the scene, and it automatically realizes that for opening up this door, effectively those don't really matter. And if we now want to do, for example, switch the stiffness of this door to something that's a little bit stiffer, we can use much fewer samples in order to update our policy because it doesn't have to think about like, is the change in performance because of all these other irrelevant objects, or is it just because of the door, which is the case. And here you can see also applying this on the real robot. So it seems like a very simple task, but when it starts trying to sort of reason about all the different blocks in the scene and trying to learn a policy for that, it is very easy for it to kind of create, like add up all these sort of errors. It might just be that things are something close to zero for a lot of their positions, but those can add up, and so it can still fail even on something that looks fairly trivial in terms of block stacking. All right. So we continued with this project, thinking about the fact that, if we can sort of identify sets of relevant variables, maybe that would be a good way to identify sort of distinct kinds of skills, right? So you can imagine, for example, trying to open up a door, where maybe one skill has to sort of unlock a door, have to unlock it. Others might just go for the handle. And so, you could learn two skills, one for opening up unlocked doors and one for unlocking doors and then opening them up. And so the way that we approached this was to say, we have a general space of context. So again, if we think about, for example, block stacking, we can provide the robot with a bunch of these different instances. We can perform CREST, which was the algorithm I was just explaining on the previous slides. And we can use those to identify different sort of situations where different variables are more relevant, all right? So, you might have some cases where, in this case, it's sort of what you'll call like linear, they're all in a line, so there's a much higher probability that you're going to have an obstacle between them. So in some cases, if there's an obstacle object, that's going to be considered relevant. But if there are situations where there's no obstacle between them, then we don't have to worry about that, right? Once we have sort of our data generating regions, so we have sort of divided our context into different regions, we can learn policies for each one of them. The preconditions of those policies might still be a little bit bigger, right? So you might have something that still works in these other domains, even though they were only trained based on their data generating regions. And then ultimately, we can pack the preconditions together with our policies and create a skill library. So we again try this on a block stacking environment. In this case, it effectively learned 3 different skills. This is for the linear one in particular. So for example, the height of the block on the bottom, in some cases it considered that relevant, and for another skill it considered irrelevant. So if you have, for example, a small block, because there's a compliance in the simulated robot, it doesn't really matter how far down you go, right? As long as it's kind of a certain size, you can just kind of go down and it'll adapt to that. Whereas, some of the skills, it was a little bit bigger. If it pushed down too far, that was kind of a critical failure. And so like one of the skills also considered that. And I'm trying to remember what the third one is. But we also looked into sort of extrapolating this. So taking these, especially the linear policies, because they're very simple, trying to go to sort of creating a whole block or like a whole tower with these now, because they're sort of better at extrapolating. They actually work fairly well to get to sort of 4 or 5 blocks. It's not the neatest tower, so we do start getting some problems, and we're still, there is some extrapolation, so you do get some offsets that are not exactly 1, or some parameters are not exactly 1. So for 3 blocks, it might be okay to be sort of at 1.1, kind of the height compared to the tower. But as you keep going higher and higher, that's obviously going to be an even bigger sort of overshoot. And similarly, we also looked at this for sort of peg insertion. So in this case, we had 5 different skills. So we always have had these environments where there's a hole, there's some walls relative to it. We don't know exactly where the hole is, but we know where they are relative to the walls. And so I think for these skills, we're effectively just exploiting individual walls to figure out, like, localize the object relative to that, and then slide along the other direction. And I think the 5th one effectively didn't use any of the walls. But that was the most reliable one. And in this case, again, we can solve about 96% by combining those different skills. And yeah, I guess one other thing to mention about this is that, we have these sort of linear and these nonlinear ones. As you can see, the linear ones actually perform fairly well, right? So often we can sort of learn simpler skills by learning multiple of them, rather than trying to sort of learn a single nonlinear policy that tries to encompass all the situations. All right, so thinking again about modularity, this is a little bit more recent work, whole 2023, I guess it's already a year old again now. So, we're thinking about the inputs. So in the previous one, we had sort of various, state information. We assumed we kind of, know the height of the objects, to know the positions. But we also want to think about sort of direct sensory inputs. And one of the challenges is obviously that we need to consider multiple types of inputs, right? So we want to have the robot be very reactive. We want it to be sort of very generalized. We want it to sort of think about haptics as well as vision. But we can't really just treat all these sensor modalities the same way, right? Because they're very distinct sensors. So we proposed a network such as the one shown here. So obviously our outputs are sort of, the end effector positions, or the, And we have three different inputs. So first one is a third-person view, which is effectively a head looking down on the scene. This should kind of give you very general information about the scene, where are objects, what are the semantics of the scene. We also have a wrist-mounted camera. This should be a little bit more reactive, right? We want to be able to sort of, adjust our fingertips to sort of nicely fit around objects before we make contact. And then once we make contact, we want to use force control to make sure that we're keeping stable contact with the object. And as you can see here, we also have to consider the different frequencies, right? So these very large language models that we may want to use for the generalization at that high level, we can't run them super fast, so maybe 5 hertz, but we definitely don't want to throttle our force control to 5 hertz, so we can leave that one at, for example, 75 hertz to be a little bit more reactive, right? And then in the middle, we have the 20 hertz here. In addition to sort of the different frequencies, we also should be thinking about sort of the training process. So for example, for the vision language model, we found it very useful to just freeze that one. Whenever we try to sort of fine tune it on the data that we had, it tended to sort of overfit and lose a lot of that initial generalization behavior. Whereas, for example, the ResNet 18, so for this first-person wrist-mounted view, there we actually did a lot of domain randomization, so we changed the colors of blocks, we did sort of pixel noise in order to make that a little bit more robust and thinking about sort of that local kind of geometry. It's actually an interesting thing that kind of came out of this. So I had a discussion with my students whether this is a bug or a feature. But what sometimes could happen is that if I sort of said, okay, go to the yellow block, right? So you can see the yellow block there. What would happen is that the hand would kind of move over it, and it would sort of, block out the yellow block from the third-person view. So you wouldn't see it anymore in the third-person view, and you'd only have the first-person view. Now, if you actually went in and changed the yellow block for a different color block at that point, it wouldn't actually care, right? Because this one has been sort of have this domain randomization where it's not as, it doesn't care about the color of the objects anymore. It's more about the geometry. And so, it's really focusing on a different aspect there. And I don't know, I thought it was a very interesting kind of behavior. I guess it's sort of, the fact that you're kind of putting attention on one object now, and you're no longer thinking about the high-level semantics of it, but rather just trying to accomplish the task locally. I don't know if I would consider that a bug or a feature, but it's definitely an interesting sort of side effect of sort of this separate kind of training behavior for the different networks.
And it's a bug that the human system has also.
Yes, I think so. I mean, this always reminds me of those examples where you have like someone doing like a magic trick and like you're focused on something and then they're changing like the background. It's like that, but it's almost the reverse because it's like, you're looking at the card and then they change the color of the card.
The paper by Dana Ballard from several decades ago in virtual reality showing that once people have grasped the cube, you can change the color.
Oh, okay.
And they don't notice it.
I need to share that paper with my students then.
I'll send it to you.
That'd be great, yeah. I didn't want to say it seemed like a very human bug, but
I think they bug for different reasons.
Yes. All right. So for evaluations, we did some simulation evaluations. We did some real robot experiments. For the simulation, we wanted to look at kind of different types of problems. So here we have some precise ones. So we have sort of small tolerances for sort of peg insertion. Even some of the grasping we'll see on the real robot, it just has like a few millimeters tolerance before it messes up. Dynamic, if anyone knows, this is the CMU ball bot. So this is a robot that's effectively balancing on a ball. So as the robot reaches out, it's going to have to be balancing. So the whole body kind of moves with the hand. So this was kind of our example of a dynamic task that the robot could learn. And then we have sort of these coarse tasks where the robot has to do some pick and place. This is sort of very common, I would say, in the literature. So we wanted to kind of look at, how well does it work if we need something more precise or something more dynamic. Here you can see sort of the performances. As you might expect, the coarse tasks are, the highest performance. They're the sort of the easiest. If we remove, for example, the force torque, very little performance difference. If we, for example, get the third person views, that's the head effectively. That's the biggest drop in performance. But then as we go to sort of, the more challenging tasks, such as the precise or the dynamic, we see much bigger drops in performance. So for example, for the dynamic one, we need the forces to really be able to perform the task. Whereas the sort of, a simple scene, so removing the head information is not as important. And you can also see here some baselines, so RT1, BCZ. Generally, we get good performance in the coarse tasks across the different methods, but as we go from more precise or more dynamic tasks, we sort of lose a lot of that performance. All right, and here you can see this on a real robot. It still has some issues with, for example, alignment, I would say. So picking up the objects, like I said, at first it seems like a really easy task, but then you realize that it is not a lot of gaps between the fingers, so it does need to get quite good alignment. And if we sort of remove the in-hand camera, we do get about a factor of 10 drop in performance. Peg insertion, like I said, there's a little bit when it gets occluded. It sometimes gets a little bit jammed up there. So some things we can improve upon. But it definitely shows the benefit of sort of taking multiple sensor modalities and really thinking about sort of how each one of them should be trained in order to get the most out of them. All right, so just some of the key takeaways what we've seen so far. So, we should be thinking about composing skills from multiple object-centered controllers. I'm much of the mind that we should have sort of more tailored skill representations. The robot should be able to choose what kind of representations it should be using. And if we do that, then we can get a lot more efficient learning because often we only need to learn a small number of parameters. And we can sort of reuse a lot of these individual controllers between different tasks. If we have an internal model, sure, you can do domain randomization, but it's also very useful for actually structuring the skill, trying to figure out what's relevant, what's not, doing sort of this causal reasoning and interventions in the simulation. And it allows you to really quickly reduce the space of your state space to the things that are really important for that specific skill. And then finally, consider the complementary strengths of sensors and how you can really extract that by thinking about the data that you give, the augmentations, and also sort of the architectures and pre-training. All right, good. Any questions? No. All right. Quick sip. As we go into the next part, which is learning scope. So when I think about a scope, the first thing that always comes to my mind is preconditions, right? So preconditions pretty much means that we have a skill policy, and I always think of it like almost like a contract, right? If I'm within the preconditions and I execute the skill policy, then I should get the desired effect, right? If I have a door opening policy and I'm standing over here and I just throw myself at the door, flop through the ground, then I executed the skill, but it didn't actually work. So I would say that I was outside the preconditions, right? And the reason why preconditions are so important is because they really allow us to define a scope, right? You can imagine skiing, right? Who here skis or snowboards? Right. So exactly, that kind of, I'm not sure what the question is here. I think all of us can kind of look at a slope and kind of say like, oh yeah, I would be able to do that, or I would not be able to do that, right? It would be ridiculous for me to assume that everyone who just raised their hand would be like, oh yeah, I can go down a triple black, slope, blindfolded. That's just not how that works, right? So I think, preconditions are really going to be the key to bringing robots into the real world. I strongly believe that the first robots we really have in like kitchen environments and stuff like that aren't going to be able to do a lot, but they're going to have a really good understanding of what they can do, right? And so, we did some work on precondition learning, for example, here, looking at learning from point cloud data, in order to sort of, look at where the object is, be able to figure out which skills in terms of sliding and, prehensile and grasping we can use. And then it ultimately becomes a classification problem, right? Am I within the preconditions of the skill or not? But we're also interested in thinking about the modularity of this, right? So how can we sort of decompose tasks into smaller parts that are maybe easier to learn so that we can then learn the preconditions themselves in a much more efficient manner. So if you imagine here, we have a robot, we're trying to do a cutting task. The question is, can I cut this cucumber safely? And rather than just looking at the scene and trying to go directly, what we can do is we can try to decompose the scene. Right? We can identify individual objects, we can extract, for example, voxel representations of them, and we can think about the individual interactions between those objects, and then create a graph structure which we can then use for classifying whether or not the overall scene is going to be. And the reason why this sort of decomposition is nice is because it allows us to sort of focus in on these pairwise interactions, right? So the scene might be very complicated, but often the actual interactions between objects are a lot simpler. And so what we did is we learned sort of embeddings for each of these edges by looking at sort of large-scale data collection and simulation. So here we can see we always have an anchor object, the yellow one. We have a blue object, which is sort of the interacting object. And what we can do is we can just perform a lot of different tests on this, right? We can perform lots of different actions, and we can see how the what the effects are of that. And with that information, we can create triplets. So effectively, if we have an anchor situation, so for example here, we have a big cylinder with a block right above it, and this is the voxel representation over here, so this will be actually fed into the network. We can have other scenes, so for example, this one over here, or this one over here. And if we think about different actions that we can apply, so for example, if we go to the left, in all the cases, the blue object just goes to the left, there's no difference, same with the right. But for example, if we go downward, then we'll get the fact that, in this case, there's a force going downward, but actually for this one, there's also a very large torque, all right? So it kind of helps to distinguish the fact that, we get this idea of like being sort of on the edge of an object, right? We don't have to quite make it a symbolic difference, but we can kind of say that because we have this discrepancy here, these are probably, shouldn't be considered sort of similar, but the anchor and the positive should be. And so what we can do then is we can learn a triplet loss. So we're effectively learning a network that's going to take each pair of our voxels in order to give us an embedding. This is our ease. And we can, on the one hand, learn to just predict what the the outputs are, but we can also learn a triplet that's simply going to take these embeddings and make sure that the positive and the anchors are generally closer to each other than the anchor and the negative. All right, and so that's just going to give us a little bit of a structure. So we have this embedding space where more similar kinds of interactions between objects are going to be closer together, and ones that are dissimilar are going to be further apart. Once we have that, we can use that as the input to our graph neural network. So each object is going to be a node. We're going to have embeddings for each one of our edges, which is, we're just going to effectively put those into this neural network that we've learned. And then we can train this actually on just a small set of data. So, we can get tens of thousands of samples in simulation for those very simple interactions. But then for more complicated scenes, we found that even like 25 samples is actually fairly efficient. All right, so here we have some examples. So let's look at the cutting one, for example. This is our scene. We can sort of extract the voxels using representation, using some cameras around the table. We generate the graph. We try to do the classification. And what it predicts is with our algorithm says that's not going to work safely. The baseline, just looking at vision directly, says that's fine. And if we start executing it, we see that we start actually stabbing into the bell pepper, which we would consider not a very safe interaction, right? Nobody wants to be stabbing into other objects when you're trying to cut one specific object. But we can also think about, with that graph representation, if we were to actually remove that bell pepper, then our model would say that's actually safe then, it will work, and therefore we can actually use, perform that task having removed the bell pepper. For the block stacking, block removal, I should say, we're looking at which blocks we can remove. I think one of the key results is actually not just the fact that we can use it on these sort of blocks, but rather that it generalizes fairly well to other blocks, right? Because we sort of captured representations about like being on the edge of objects and versus being like solidly placed. We can learn preconditions for these sort of Jenga-style blocks and then automatically generalize it to more sort of classical letter blocks, right? Because effectively those relationships about what it means to be properly on an object or sort of on the edge was already being learned by the network, and it effectively just needs to learn that you should have stable placements rather than sort of on the edge placements. All right. Looking at preconditions, often we think about these in terms of skills. So when can I open up a door? But what we're going to do is we're going to take the idea a little bit further and think about how we can apply it to other kinds of models, in particular transition models, right? So there's the common saying that no model is perfect, but some of the models are useful, and so it's really a question about can we figure out where a model is useful? So you can imagine a state action space with different kinds of models. You might have a very simple analytical model, you might have a learned model, and you might have a simulation. And in different regions, each one of those is going to work, or it's not going to work, right? There's always going to be some limitation where maybe the simulation blows up, or you're just too far away from your training data for it to make accurate predictions. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to figure out for each one of these models, where does it actually work, right? Where does it give accurate predictions to the real world? So that we can then combine them into sort of one sort of collage of models that's allows us to kind of switch between them and also choose the faster ones when possible, right? So often simulations can be very slow, and if I'm going to get a similar accuracy using just a very fast analytical model, I should probably be biasing my search using the analytical model. So how does this work? Well, we have our real-world execution, right? We take our state, we perform an action or a skill. We also have our transition model. So, for every single model, we can take that model, put it in. We get out our predicted next state. We have the real next state that occurred, and we assume that we have a distance function to sort of say how different are these. So how accurate are we to actually make the correct prediction given that transition model in that state in action? Now, obviously, we can't sort of always have this. So what we want to do is we want to learn a deviation estimator. So given the state in action, for each one of these models, we want to be able to predict this d value directly, right? And then effectively to make it a precondition to as a classifier, we're just adding a threshold on top of that so that if the prediction is beyond a certain sort of deviation, then we wouldn't use that model. All right, so using that idea, so we collected some data for some tasks. So for example, here we had some models for putting blocks into drawers and opening up drawers. We had analytical models for sort of, picking up and moving around blocks. We had an analytical model for opening up the drawer. We also had a simulation of the actual drawer and then the block. And we developed a A-star search algorithm that focuses on sort of using only obviously the models that are within their preconditions. And then we had sort of a weighted bias so that we always expanded the faster models first. So if the analytical model was going to be good enough, we could use that one. And if it wasn't, then maybe we had to fall back on the simulator. And in some cases, we found that actually none of the models accurately represented it. So here you can see, for example, this block here, if you grasp it at the end, it tends to slip down. Neither the simulator nor the analytical model really captured that, but that's perfectly fine because we now know that it's not within the preconditions of any of our models, so we avoid grasping it there because it's just not going to give us any good predictions no matter what model we use. So by combining the different models and considering where they're actually accurate or not, we were able to get plans that are sort of both faster and also more reliable, right? Like even if we use the simulation, because the simulation is going to have its limits, such as the grasping at the end, we sort of still see improved performance over using only the simulation, both in terms of time and also success rate. All right. And more recently, we also looked at active NDE learning. So looking at actually how can we sort of actively learn these deviation estimators, so generating trajectories, thinking about sort of how do we sort of explore this space in order to be able to capture the preconditions accurately. This is an example we looked at where you're trying to pour. Obviously, this plant is going to make it very difficult to kind of predict how the water runs down it, and effectively what it learns is to kind of pour lower down. This is still the training process, so you are going to see some high pours where it's technically spilling on the side. But yeah, effectively this was a paper, ICRA 2023. If you want more details, you can look into that. Just looking at the time, I'm kind of wondering if I should jump ahead a little bit, because I do want to make sure there's time for questions and answers at the end.
Do you have more than half an hour at least?
Okay, but yeah. So, wrong way. Okay, I'm going to skip over the next two projects. These were kind of just the idea that if we know what the preconditions are of our model, then effectively we can sort of figure out regions where our model is going to fail, and then we can learn skills to, for example, patch that. So I'll just go to the results of this one. I'm going through all the details. So here you can see the training. So effectively the robot has a model, it's predicting every step what it's going to do. It's executing it as best as it can. It realizes that there's been a deviation, and at this point a human takes over and gives a demonstration of how to perform the task from that location. Once we then switch over to test time, it can predict or it can create a plan, see whether the plan is going to fail. If it does predict that it's going to fail, then it's going to instead learn a plan to the preconditions of that skill and execute it from there. And I'd say the key insight from this one is that sort of this combination of planning and learning is very powerful, because it means that the learning really only needs to focus on the situations where it's really needed, right? So learning to effectively move from any location to the insertion is fairly difficult. There might be lots of different obstacles. It's unnecessarily difficult because the planner can handle that. And so really where we need learning is just right at the end for that small little bit of insertion. And so we can use like 20 demonstrations to nicely learn this task rather than trying to get demonstration from the entire scene. And we can do this because we're leveraging the planner in the situations where it's applicable. All right, this is recovery learning. Also a great paper by Shivam Butts. Also looking at this idea of sort of figuring out how we can sort of make a sequence of skills more robust by sort of figuring out which skills, which recovery skills to learn, so where to get back on track. But if people have questions about this, I'm happy to go back to it later. All right, so some of the key takeaways, looking just at the first two. So often complex scenes can be decomposed into simpler interactions, so we can focus our interactions on those smaller sort of interactions and then combine them to represent more complicated scenes. And it's also very important that robots know the capabilities. So if you're using any kind of model, it's great to use models, but they will always have their limits, and you can actually have the robot be reasoning about those limitations and increase the robustness of the system overall by knowing when another solution is needed. All right, so the third and final part that I want to talk about is modular hardware. So we're very excited about sort of vibrotactile sensing. I know you guys are as well, of acoustic sensing. So we've done some work on, for example, identifying different vegetables based on vibrations in the knife. I don't know why this is not playing. There you go. We've also been looking at sort of contact localization based on vibrations in this sort of sonic boom tube that we have. So there's 3 microphones in there. Based on the signals from those microphones, we can localize where on the tube it's actually being struck. We've also been looking at things such as detecting successful and failure Lego places. And one of the reasons why we do a lot of focus on contact microphones is because they're very robust sensors, right? They can be kind of hidden away on the back of the object. They're not directly interacting with anything. The vibrations go through the objects. And so, there's a certain robustness to that. We can't always have that. So, if we're thinking about things such as tactile sensors, gel site, for example, those are going to have to be making contacts. If we have any kind of probing sensors, those are going to need to be sort of interacting as well. So here we have a project, it's a collaboration with George Cantor, looking at agricultural robots. So we have these corn stalks in the field. We want the robot to go and actually insert a nitrate probe into them in order to get a reading of what the nitrate levels are. So nitrates are very important for sort of looking at the amount of fertilizer that the plants are absorbing. Sadly thinking about the climate change and the fact that we need to sort of, stop over fertilizing food, and also making sure that we're finding the kinds of crops that can absorb the fertilizer more efficiently. And so we have these little nitrate sensors. There's 2 little electrodes here, and they have these coatings on it that effectively connect to nitrates, and that changes the conductivity. We didn't design the sensors. This was a collaboration with Iowa State University. But what we need to do is we need to go around and effectively place these fairly close to the ground into the middle of the stalk so that we can collect readings. Okay. And as you can imagine, it's fairly forceful interaction. So we're literally taking a little stick, jabbing into the side, and every so often we're actually going to be, losing or scratching off the surface of the sensor, so we need to be able to replace them. So one of the things we looked at is actually designing it so that the robot could replace the sensor itself. So here you can see a closer up of the robot. Here we can see the arm underneath the platform with our gripper that we designed. And this gripper has a single actuator. So as we sort of move the actuator forward, it's going to close its fingers around the object, in this case the corn stalk, and it's got the little sensor which at the end gets stuck into it. And if we drive the sensor in the opposite direction, so we pull it all the way out, we also loosen the sensor. So effectively, we made each of the sensors so that's a simple PCB board. It's got 2 contacts. It has a sort of tree-like shape so that can kind of get hooked in through the sensor, so that when we pull all the way back, the little lever moves to the side, it frees up the sensor, and now we can actually replace it. So here you can see the robot kind of moving into position. So here it kind of knocks it down. It nicely lines itself. You can see these sort of spikes next to it. So those are just for sort of using contact to kind of align the gripper with the box of sensors. And then once we're sort of in position, we retract the actuator, it clicks onto it, and then we can just pull it out. All right. So as we're sort of switching out the sensors in the field, it's also important to think about calibration. So we also looked at sort of designing a calibration suite. So we have high nitrate solution one, low nitrate solution the other, and just distilled water in the third one for cleaning. So we can effectively go out into the field, switch out a sensor, calibrate it, and then go for the next insertion, which looks a little bit like this. So we actually took the robot from CMU over to Iowa. So nice long car ride. Some of us got to fly, which was nice. And we evaluate the system. We're still kind of in some cases off by a couple of millimeters. So it is a very high precision insertion that you need. So even if you're 2-3 millimeters off, you might get one of the electrodes sticking out. So we're still getting some of the sort of failures at the bottom here from that. So we're getting overall about 50% success rate. Also a little bit of sort of making sure we are close enough to the ground, something we need to work on. But we can sort of run this reliably on its own so that it would sort of, in between every couple of cornstalk insertions, replace the sensor automatically and be able to get that data. All right, on to the last project. So I'm looking for the Q&A. So when I became a junior professor, I kind of made myself a promise not to design a hand. So I kind of thought that there was that, there are no good hands out there. Why are there no good hands? I know I will make the good robot hand. And then a few years later, people kind of be like, oh, you know what? I realize now why it's difficult. I think everyone in this room knows how difficult it is to design a good hand. And so, I kind of told myself I'm not going to work on developing hand hardware. I didn't quite keep that promise. And there's a reason. So I think the key thing is don't do it alone. So you need people who actually know mechanics, who understand material properties. In my case, that was Professor Zeynep Temel. And so what we've been working on is actually developing delta grippers. So these are hands, or arrays as you'll see as well, based on the delta robot design. So effectively, we have 3 linear actuators. We have this parallel linkage system for each of our fingers. And as we sort of expand and or retract each one of these, the fingertip is going to move in XYZ. So effectively, you can keep nearly parallel fingertips, but move in all 3 translational directions. We thought, okay, if we can do a hand, how can we expand it higher? So we made an array. So this is a 8x8 fingers, effectively, so like a tabletop of fingers. You can also see, allows some different strategies. So we've got some gating strategies here. We can make walls, for example, as well to kind of push against. And I think this was actually a really important step, not just for, it's cool to have an array, but also because it really forced us to think about the fabrication, right? So one of the nice things about this system is that, the parallel linkages, each one of these is just a single 3D printed component. It has living hinges. You still need to put like a fingertip on top of it, but you can easily modify that design by just changing, the length of the linkages. The base, here we have a 4-finger hand. This is just an acrylic piece, so if you want to have a bigger hand, you can just cut out a bigger acrylic piece. And so, become fairly easy. You can also have sort of coupled parts, so, rather than having every single delta individually actuated, you can also sort of have actuators that control multiple of them, so 2 fingers might always be moving closer together or further apart. And we also want to be able to sort of give demonstrations to the system. So we created a kind of kinematic twin, we call it. So effectively, this is very similar to the hand that we have. Linkages are almost the same. So these have these, you might notice these are a little bit more reddish. There's a solid block in the middle. These are just made of just flexible, turn out to work better. And rather than having actuators, we have potentiometers, so sliders at the top. And so we can effectively, give demonstrations by just moving these parts down here, and then move the fingers. And then, because everyone loves diffusion policies, we actually learned also some diffusion policies from those demonstrations using just a in-hand camera as feedback. So right in the middle of these 4 fingers is the camera looking down, which is kind of what you can see here, right? So this is the observation. We're still working on adding some additional sensors. So for example, the vibrations, for some of the force torque sensors in there. But for this case, it was just the vision. And here you can see some of the sort of in-hand policies that we can learn using this approach. So we can do some translational and rotational ones, so ball rolling in hand, syringe pushing, so effectively grasping with 2 fingers and then sliding to the other one. We use some Dagger to get some additional demonstrations to make it a little bit more robust. But then with those additional demonstrations, we can actually do things like the syringe pushing fairly reliably. You can also see things like lifting the block. We've also done ones where like the hand is upright, so it's not on a tabletop, some of these cases. And then, shape insertion. All right. So, key takeaway to thinking about sort of the reliability of robots, think about having robots being able to actually replace their own sensors or the critical components. For that sensor insertion, it was just one PCB that had to be replaced, but we can do that autonomously. And make sure to also have everything you need in the field then, like the calibration methods. The modularity for the delta, I think is really exciting because it really creates a space of potential designs of the hand. So you can easily tailor for bigger hands or smaller hands depending on your application. Like I said, I think having sort of this 8x8 grid really gave us a strong drive towards sort of easier fabrication methods. I think it's opened up some interesting new challenges in robot dexterity. And last but definitely not least, this is a great example of using collaborations to explore new areas. I was a little bit hesitant to work on hands. I'm really excited about the hand we've developed now with Zana Temel. Agricultural robotics, there's a lot of sort of overhead in getting to that area, right? Like you need to know people who actually have fields. You can't just randomly go into cornfields with a robot. And so, George opened up a lot of possibilities there. All right. So I'd like to thank all of my students who have been working on these projects over the years. A lot of them have already graduated or are in the process of graduating. If you see them at any conferences, say hi. They don't bite. So we looked at modular skills and structuring skills. We looked at the scope and thinking about not just the preconditions of skills, but also the preconditions of models and how we can use those to sort of combine multiple models and detect when none of our models are working. And we also thought about sort of hardware modularity in terms of sort of creating sort of these individual figures that can be composed to different ways to create different hands or arrays. And also thinking about sort of replacing, for example, probe sensors autonomously. All right, with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to the questions.